Picture this moment. A cold February evening in 1944, somewhere in rural Kentucky. The wind howled outside while inside a modest farmhouse, Edgar Cayce lay motionless on his simple cot, his breathing steady but distant. His wife Gertrude sat nearby, pencil poised above her notepad, as always ready to capture whatever profound truths might emerge from her husband's unconscious state. What came through that night would shake the very foundations of how people understood death, the afterlife, and the devastating power of unresolved anger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The reading that evening was unlike anything Cayce had channeled before. Speaking in that characteristic monotone voice that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond his physical form, he began describing what he called the prison of rage that awaits those who pass from this world while clutching onto anger, resentment, and unfinished emotional business. His words were precise, clinical even, yet they carried an urgency that made everyone in that small room lean forward with anticipation and dread. According to the sleeping prophet, as he would later be known, death does not automatically cleanse the soul of its earthly burdens. Instead, those who die while harboring deep grudges, seething with unresolved anger or consumed by hatred toward others, find themselves trapped in what he described as spheres of their own making. These were not places of punishment imposed by some external divine judgment, but rather self-created prisons built from the very emotions they refused to release while alive. The revelation came through a reading requested by Martha Henderson, a widow from nearby Hopkinsville, whose husband had died suddenly during a heated argument with his brother over family property. She had been tormented for months by nightmares and what she described as a heavy, oppressive presence in her home. When Cayce entered his trance state to investigate, what he discovered left the small gathering speechless. Thomas Henderson, Martha's deceased husband, had not moved on to what most would consider the traditional afterlife. Instead, his consciousness remained earthbound, anchored by the fury he felt toward his brother at the moment of his death. Cayce described seeing Thomas trapped in a gray, shadowy realm of his own creation, reliving the argument over and over, unable to progress spiritually because his rage had become like chains binding him to the lower astral planes. But the reading went far deeper than just one man's unfortunate situation. Cayce began explaining that this phenomenon was far more common than anyone realized. He spoke of vast regions in the spirit world populated by souls who had died while consumed by negative emotions, particularly anger and grudges. These beings, he said, were not evil or damned in the traditional sense, but rather stuck, unable to move forward in their spiritual evolution because they had become so identified with their earthly resentments that they literally could not let go, even in death. The implications were staggering. If Cayce was correct, then the way a person died emotionally and spiritually was just as important as how they had lived. A lifetime of good deeds could be overshadowed by dying in a state of rage or unforgiveness. The consciousness, he explained, carries forward whatever emotional state dominates at the moment of transition, and if that state is one of anger or resentment, it becomes the foundation of the soul's immediate afterlife experience. What made this reading particularly compelling was the level of detail Cayce provided about these trapped souls and their conditions. He described how they experienced time differently, sometimes reliving traumatic moments for what felt like centuries, unable to break free from the psychological loops created by their unresolved anger. Some, he said, became so consumed by their rage that they began to influence the living world generations. When old Patrick Brennan died during a heated confrontation with Sean O'Malley, his widow feared the worst based on what she had heard about Cayce's reading for Martha Henderson. Sure enough, within weeks of Patrick's death, both families began experiencing a series of inexplicable misfortunes. Crops failed, livestock died mysteriously, and accidents plagued both households. When Cayce was consulted, his reading revealed that Patrick's spirit was indeed trapped by his rage, and his anger was now affecting not just the O'Malleys but his own family as well. As if his fury had become a destructive force that recognized no boundaries. The solution required both families to participate in what Cayce described as a, quote, healing ceremony, where they would collectively forgive Patrick, release their own anger toward him and each other, and essentially give his spirit permission to move on to higher realms. The ceremony, conducted on a moonless night in the disputed field where so much anger had been generated, was unlike anything the rural Kentucky community had ever witnessed. As the two families stood in a circle, holding hands and speaking words of forgiveness into the darkness, witnesses later reported feeling a tangible shift in the atmosphere. The oppressive heaviness that had seemed to hang over both properties for weeks suddenly lifted, and several people claimed to see a bright light rising from the center of the circle before disappearing into the starry sky. From that night forward, both families experienced a return to normal life, and the feud that had poisoned their community for decades came to an end. Word of these dramatic healings spread far beyond Kentucky, reaching the ears of researchers, ministers, and curious seekers from across the country. Many came to witness Cayce's readings for themselves, hoping to understand this mysterious connection between anger, death, and the afterlife. What they discovered was a consistent pattern that seemed to validate the sleeping prophet's most controversial claims. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a psychiatrist from Chicago, arrived in 1945 to investigate what she assumed would be elaborate psychological theater designed to prey on grieving families. Instead, she found herself documenting case after case of inexplicable phenomena that seemed to support Cayce's descriptions of trapped spirits and their effects on the living world. Her detailed notes, preserved in the archives of the Association for Research and Enlightenment, provide some of the most compelling evidence that Cayce's readings were revealing genuine spiritual truths. One case that particularly impressed Dr. Thornton involved the Morrison family, whose patriarch had died in a state of rage after discovering his business partner's betrayal. For months after his death, the partner, Benjamin Walsh, had been experiencing what could only be described as supernatural harassment. Tools would disappear from his workshop, strange sounds echoed through his house at night, and he suffered from nightmares so vivid and terrifying that he had barely slept in weeks. When Cayce was consulted, his reading revealed that James Morrison's spirit was indeed focusing all of its rage on Walsh, essentially trying to drive him to madness or death as revenge for the business betrayal. But the reading also revealed something Walsh had never told anyone. He actually was guilty of the betrayal Morrison had discovered. Cayce's unconscious mind somehow knew details about the embezzlement that only Walsh himself knew, lending credibility to the entire phenomenon. The solution required Walsh to make full restitution to Morrison's widow, publicly confess his crimes, and participate in a forgiveness ritual designed to release Morrison's spirit from its earthbound prison. The moment Walsh completed these actions, the supernatural harassment ceased completely, and he reported sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. Morrison's widow also reported feeling a profound sense of closure and peace that she had been unable to find since her husband's death. Dr. Thornton's investigation uncovered dozens of. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Appearing as what people commonly called angry spirits or malevolent ghosts. The farmhouse fell silent as Cayce continued, describing case after case of souls he claimed to see trapped in these self-imposed prisons. There was the merchant from Louisville who died furious about a business betrayal, now eternally replaying scenarios of revenge that would never bring satisfaction. A mother from Nashville who passed away while estranged from her daughter, forever trying to justify her actions and blame others for the broken relationship, unable to accept responsibility or find peace. According to Cayce's reading, these souls were not beyond help, but their rescue required intervention from the living world. Family members could assist trapped spirits through prayer, forgiveness, and what he called releasing rituals that helped dissolve the emotional anchors keeping their loved ones earthbound. This revelation gave Martha Henderson hope that she could actually help her husband's spirit find peace, but it also placed an enormous responsibility on the living to examine their own relationships and unresolved conflicts. The reading took an even more dramatic turn when Cayce began describing how these trapped souls affected the living. He explained that people who died angry often remained psychically connected to the objects of their rage, creating what he termed energetic harassment of those still in physical form. This could manifest as persistent bad luck, unexplained accidents, relationship problems, or chronic health issues affecting the targets of the deceased person's resentment. Martha herself was experiencing this phenomenon. Her husband's earthbound rage was creating a dark cloud over her daily life, affecting her sleep, her health, and her ability to move forward with her own life. Cayce explained that Thomas's spirit was unconsciously trying to draw her into his emotional state, wanting her to feel the anger and injustice he felt, as if sharing his rage might somehow validate it or provide the resolution he desperately sought. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of the reading was Cayce's description of what he called anger inheritance. He claimed that unresolved rage and grudges could be passed down through family lines, affecting children and grandchildren who had no direct connection to the original conflict. These inherited emotional patterns, he said, were one of the primary sources of seemingly inexplicable family problems, mental illness, and generational cycles of dysfunction. The reading concluded with specific instructions from Martha on how to help her husband's spirit find peace and protect herself from further psychic interference. The process involved a combination of prayer, meditation, and what Cayce called forgiveness work that would break the emotional chains binding Thomas to his earthly rage. But he emphasized that this was not just about helping the dead, it was about preventing the living from creating the same spiritual trap for themselves. As word of this extraordinary reading spread throughout the small community, people began examining their own lives with new urgency. The idea that dying angry could trap one's soul in a prison of endless suffering was both terrifying and motivating. Suddenly, family feuds that had raged for years began to heal as people realized the potential eternal consequences of holding on to their resentments. The local pastor, Reverend William Crawford, initially dismissed Cayce's claims as nonsensical and potentially heretical. But when several of his parishioners reported dramatic improvements in their lives after following Cayce's advice about releasing grudges and forgiving their enemies, he began to pay closer attention. What he observed challenged everything he thought he knew about death, the afterlife, and the nature of spiritual progression. One particularly compelling case involved the Brennan family, Irish immigrants who had been feuding with their neighbors, the O'Malleys, for over 2 decades. The conflict had started over a property line dispute but had escalated into a bitter hatred that affected both families for similar cases where Cayce's readings had revealed accurate information about deceased individuals and their unfinished emotional business. In every instance where families followed his recommendations for releasing trapped spirits, the reported paranormal activity ceased, and the living family members experienced dramatic improvements in their mental health, relationships, and general well-being. Perhaps even more significant were the cases where Cayce's readings prevented people from creating these spiritual traps for themselves. When he counseled individuals who were dying while consumed with anger or resentment, his guidance often helped them release their negative emotions before death, ensuring their smooth transition to higher spiritual realms. These cases provided a kind of before and after comparison that strengthened the evidence for his claims. Sarah Mitchell, a woman dying of tuberculosis in 1946, had spent her final months consumed with hatred toward the doctor she believed had misdiagnosed her condition, costing her precious time that might have saved her life. When her family consulted Cayce about her deteriorating mental state, his reading revealed that her rage was not only making her physical suffering worse, but was also creating the conditions for her spirit to become trapped after death. The reading provided specific guidance for helping Sarah release her anger and find peace before her transition. Through a series of guided meditations and forgiveness exercises, she was able to let go of her resentment toward the doctor and focus instead on gratitude for the love she had shared with her family. When she finally passed away 3 weeks later, her death was peaceful and serene, and her family reported sensing her presence as a loving, protective force rather than an angry, earthbound spirit. These successful interventions began to establish what Cayce called the laws of spiritual transition. According to his readings, the emotional and mental state at the moment of death was perhaps the most important factor in determining the soul's immediate afterlife experience. Positive emotions like love, gratitude, and forgiveness facilitated easy passage to higher spiritual realms, while negative emotions like anger, hatred, and resentment created barriers that could trap the soul in lower vibrational states for extended periods. The implications extended far beyond individual cases. Cayce's reading suggested that battlefields, sites of murders, and places where intense anger and violence had occurred often became haunted, precisely because so many souls had died in states of rage and were now trapped in those locations. This explanation for hauntings and paranormal activity was both more compassionate and more empowering than traditional religious views that simply consigned angry souls to hell or punishment. According to Cayce, these trapped spirits were not evil beings deserving of damnation, but rather confused and suffering souls who needed help releasing their earthly attachments. The living could assist them through prayer, forgiveness, and understanding, essentially serving as spiritual rescuers who could help free their ancestors and loved ones from self-imposed prisons of rage. This perspective began to transform how people in Cayce's community approached death and dying. Families started having honest conversations about unresolved conflicts, making efforts to heal relationships before it was too late, and ensuring that their loved ones died in states of peace rather than anger. The practice of death preparation became as important as any medical care, focusing on the emotional and spiritual readiness of the dying person. The most profound cases involved individuals who had been estranged from family members for years or even decades. When faced with the possibility that dying angry might trap their souls in suffering, many people found the motivation to reach out, apologize, forgive, and heal relationships that had seemed permanently broken. The fear of eternal spiritual imprisonment proved to be a powerful catalyst for forgiveness and reconciliation. Robert Coleman, a wealthy businessman from Louisville, had been estranged from his son Michael for over 15 years, following a bitter dispute about the family business. When Robert was diagnosed with a terminal illness in 1947, his wife consulted Cayce about how to help her husband prepare for death. The reading revealed that Robert's continued anger toward his son was creating exactly the kind of emotional anchor that could trap his spirit after death. The reading provided specific guidance for healing the relationship, but it required both men to release their pride and resentment. Initially, both Robert and Michael resisted, each insisting that the other should make the first move toward reconciliation. However, as Robert's condition deteriorated and the reality of his approaching death became undeniable, fear of the spiritual consequences finally motivated him to reach out to his son. The reunion between father and son was emotional and transformative for both men. Years of hurt and misunderstanding melted away as they focused on their love for each other rather than their past grievances. When Robert died 2 months later, he passed peacefully with his son holding his hand, and the family reported sensing his presence as a blessing rather than experiencing any of the negative phenomena associated with trapped spirits. These healing stories began to establish practical protocols for what Cayce called conscious dying, or spiritual death preparation. The process involved reviewing all significant relationships, identifying any sources of anger or resentment, and taking concrete steps to resolve conflicts or at least release negative emotions. For those who were too ill or weak to engage in active reconciliation, the process could involve prayer, meditation, and internal forgiveness work that freed the dying person from their emotional burdens. As news of these techniques spread, ministers from various denominations began incorporating elements of Cayce's approach into their pastoral care for the dying. Even those who disagreed with his metaphysical claims recognized the psychological and emotional benefits of helping people die in states of peace rather than anger. The practice of deathbed forgiveness and reconciliation became increasingly common, leading to more peaceful deaths and fewer reports of haunting or paranormal activity. The scientific community remained largely skeptical of Cayce's claims about trapped spirits and their effects on the living, but some researchers began investigating the psychological benefits of his approach to death preparation. Studies showed that families who engaged in forgiveness work and conflict resolution before a loved one's death experienced less complicated grief, better mental health outcomes, and stronger family relationships afterward. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a researcher at the University of Virginia, conducted one of the first formal studies of what she called the Cayce method of death preparation in 1949. Her research followed 30 families through the dying process, comparing outcomes between those who used traditional approaches and those who incorporated Cayce's recommendations for addressing unresolved anger and resentment. The results were striking. Families who engaged in forgiveness work and emotional resolution reported significantly less anxiety, depression, and complicated grief in the months following their loved one's death. They also reported fewer sleep disturbances, fewer unexplained health problems, and better overall family functioning. While Dr. Hayes could not verify Cayce's claims about trapped spirits, she concluded that his approach to death preparation provided measurable psychological benefits for surviving family members. More intriguingly, Dr. Hayes documented several cases where family members reported positive dreams or visions of their deceased loved ones, experiencing them as peaceful and loving presences rather than troubled or angry spirits. These experiences, while subjective and impossible to verify scientifically, were consistent with Cayce's claims that souls who died in states of forgiveness and peace were more likely to progress normally through their spiritual development. The contrast with families who had not engaged in this preparatory work was dramatic. Those who had experienced deaths marked by unresolved anger and conflict reported significantly higher rates of what psychiatrists were beginning to recognize as complicated grief. They struggled with persistent guilt, anger, and intrusive thoughts about their deceased loved ones. Many reported feeling as though their loved one was somehow still suffering or was unable to rest in peace. These observations led Dr. Hayes to hypothesize that regardless of the metaphysical reality of Cayce's claims about trapped spirits, the psychological reality was undeniable. People who died angry or who left behind unresolved conflicts seemed to create ongoing psychological disturbance in their surviving family members. Whether this was due to actual spiritual interference or simply the natural psychological consequences of unfinished business, the practical effects were the same. By the early 1950s, word of Cayce's teachings about death and anger had spread throughout the American spiritualist community and beyond. Churches, meditation groups, and healing circles began incorporating his insights into their understanding of death and the afterlife. The idea that consciousness survived death but could be trapped by negative emotions resonated with many people's personal experiences and observations. One of the most compelling aspects of Cayce's teachings was how they explained common experiences that traditional religion had difficulty addressing. Many people had encountered what seemed to be angry or troubled spirits, had lived in houses that felt haunted or oppressive, or had experienced ongoing problems that seemed connected to deceased family members. Cayce's explanation provided a framework for understanding these phenomena that was both logical and hopeful. Unlike religious traditions that consigned angry souls to eternal damnation, Cayce's model suggested that trapped spirits could be helped and healed. This perspective empowered people to take active roles in assisting their deceased loved ones, rather than simply accepting their fate. The practice of praying for the dead took on new meaning when people understood that their prayers might literally help free trapped souls from earthbound prisons. The healing implications extended into the realm of what would later be called family systems therapy. Cayce's readings suggested that unresolved anger and trauma could affect multiple generations, creating patterns of dysfunction that persisted until the original emotional wounds were healed. This meant that helping a trapped spirit find peace could potentially heal problems affecting living descendants who had never even known the original angry individual. Maria Santos, a young mother from New Mexico, consulted Cayce in 1951 about persistent problems affecting her family. Despite their best efforts, the Santos family seemed plagued by chronic illness, financial difficulties, and relationship problems that defied explanation. 3 generations of Santos women had experienced similar struggles, leading Maria to suspect some kind of family curse or inherited problem. Cayce's reading revealed that Maria's great-grandmother, Isabella Santos, had died in 1889 while consumed with rage toward the man who had cheated her family out of their land. Isabella's spirit had remained earthbound, and her unresolved anger had been affecting her descendants for over 60 years. The reading provided detailed instructions for a family healing ceremony that would help Isabella release her rage and move on to higher spiritual realms. The ceremony required gathering as many Santos family members as possible and collectively acknowledging Isabella's suffering, expressing gratitude for her sacrifices, and formally forgiving both her and the man who had wronged the family. When the ceremony was completed, Maria reported an immediate sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. In the months that followed, the Santos family experienced dramatic improvements in their health, finances, and relationships. The chronic problems that had plagued 3 generations began to resolve, and family members reported feeling more optimistic and energetic than they had in years. The healing appeared to validate Cayce's claim that trapped spirits could indeed affect their living descendants, and that releasing these spirits could heal generational patterns of suffering. Stories like the Santos case helped establish what became known as ancestral healing practices based on Cayce's insights. Families began researching their genealogies not just for historical interest, but to identify ancestors who might have died in traumatic or angry circumstances. They would then conduct healing ceremonies designed to help these spirits find peace and break any negative patterns affecting living family members. These practices eventually evolved into more sophisticated approaches that combined Cayce's spiritual insights with modern psychological understanding of family systems and trauma. Therapists began recognizing that family problems often had historical roots that needed to be addressed before healing could occur. While they might not accept the literal reality of trapped spirits, many found that treating family problems as if they had spiritual or energetic components produced better therapeutic outcomes. The influence of Cayce's teachings about death and anger continued to grow throughout the 1950s and beyond. His insights were integrated into various New Age spiritual movements, influenced the development of hospice care, and contributed to changing attitudes about death and dying in American society. The idea that emotional preparation for death was as important as medical care became increasingly accepted, even among mainstream healthcare providers. Modern research into near-death experiences and consciousness studies has provided some support for Cayce's basic claims about the continuity of consciousness after death and the importance of emotional states during the dying process. While science cannot verify the existence of trapped spirits or their effects on the living, studies consistently show that people who die in states of peace and acceptance have better outcomes for their surviving family members. The psychological research is even more compelling. Studies of complicated grief, family trauma, and intergenerational patterns of dysfunction support many of Cayce's observations about how unresolved anger and conflict can affect multiple generations. Whether these effects are due to spiritual influences or psychological mechanisms, the practical implications remain the same. Resolving conflict and releasing anger, especially before death, benefits both the dying person and their survivors. Contemporary hospice workers often observe phenomena that align with Cayce's descriptions of conscious dying and spiritual transition. They report that people who die angry or with significant unfinished business tend to have more difficult deaths and leave behind more traumatized families. Conversely, those who spend their final days reconciling relationships and releasing resentments tend to die more peacefully and leave their families with a sense of closure and peace. The enduring appeal of Cayce's teachings about death and anger lies not just in their metaphysical implications but in their practical wisdom. Regardless of one's beliefs about the afterlife, the advice to resolve conflicts, release resentments, and approach death with forgiveness and peace makes psychological and emotional sense. These practices benefit the dying person, their families, and potentially future generations by breaking cycles of anger and dysfunction. As we face our own mortality and consider the legacy we will leave behind, Cayce's warnings about dying angry take on profound significance. His vision of consciousness trapped by rage serves as both a cautionary tale and an invitation to examine our own unresolved conflicts and resentments. The question becomes not whether we believe in literal spiritual imprisonment, but whether we want to risk passing on our anger and pain to those we love most. The families who experienced healing through Cayce's guidance discovered that releasing anger and choosing forgiveness was not about excusing others' behavior or denying legitimate grievances. Instead, it was about freeing themselves from the burden of carrying resentment and ensuring that their love, rather than their rage, would be their lasting legacy. In death, as in life, the choice between love and anger determines not only our own experience, but potentially the welfare of generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.